think it's dangerous, even more dangerous and insidious than Canadians understand, is to the exclusion of competency. It's to
Yes.
the exclusion of being prepared for your job. Or, I mean, I don't want to bring in the conversation of Elon Musk and Doge, um, but if you were to do on a very professional way, not swayed by propaganda and outrage, but you were to take a very sharp knife to the core of Ottawa, I think Canadians, especially Western Canadians, because they've been on the butt of the joke, they've been the last to receive, they've been the last to be respected or considered. But if you took a very sharp knife to it, you would be absolutely horrified at the stupidity that is hired there.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Dialogue Over Division. And my bad, I actually should have asked you how to pronounce your first name, but I'm going to just do a guess. Alise Mills.
That's absolutely correct.
Excellent. So, welcome to the show. And I'm really excited to have Alise today, even though we don't know too much about each other, really. But I understand that you worked with Stephen Harper, and I'm really keen to hear about your experience, what it was like working in that kind of capacity, and then what is going on in our country now. And we were just chatting offline and really getting into everything. So I just said, let's start recording because I am super excited to have this conversation with you about what Canadians can do so that we can take back our country, literally. So
Well,
welcome.
I am so excited to be here. As I was saying offline, you're a dynamo. I think you're fantastic. And this is an opportunity that I didn't even know I really, really wanted. But I've gotten to a point as a Canadian and as a Canadian who has worked not only in the UK and the United States, but I've also done business in the last couple of years in the Emirates and Middle East and from a North American facing position. And I've gone back and forth several times in the last 4 or 5 years, and every time I've come home, I've really noticed this, not only just a stagnation, but a deep malaise that has gripped my neighbors, my community, people I worked with in the past. There is not a lot of joy in the country. And as I said to you, it really started in British Columbia about 20 years ago when our politicians committed what I think to be a very treasonous act of selling out and breaking away established middle class Canadians from their homes.
Mhm.
And my background starts in British Columbia. Just to give you a quick overview, I worked for Gordon Campbell and in communications. And then that progressed into being, I think, the first spokesperson slash pundit for the BC Liberals. I was a BC Liberal for many, many years. I worked on several campaigns. This would have been about 2008 that I officially started doing about 13, 15 shows a week. I have worked for Brad Wall. I love Brad Wall. I think he's fantastic. And it was all during sort of the mid 2000s. And then by about 2012, no, actually, no, that's incorrect. Around 2010, I was asked to do national television, and I started at CTV as a pundit, as a conservative commentator. But obviously, my roots are very Western Canadian. And you can take the girl to Ottawa, but you can't take Western Canada out of her. You just can't. And you begin to realize you're in, upside down world in Ottawa. And but being a national pundit and being a female conservative was on the CBC or on CTV was quite a rarity at the time. And I recognized that they completely used my position to be able to say, hey, we're very diverse. It's not all liberals. It's not all NDP. Really, I was the only real conservative on by the time I got to CBC Power and Politics. And I will say Evan Solomon and Chris Hall from the CBC, two, I think, fantastic people who do not represent what I see at the CBC now, really plucked me from CTV at that time and said, and I remember Chris Hall sending me a message saying, why the heck are you at CTV? You should be on Power and Politics. And I will tell you, at that time when Evan Solomon was the host of that show, before Rosemary Barton joined, it was the toughest show. I remember having a colleague of mine having to fill in, and she said, I don't know how you do that 2, 3 times a week. I said, try 15, because being the only Western Canadian conservative female pundit, they would spin me off into the radio network or one of their satellites, and or regional news for my interviews. And so I would spend a lot of time at CBC Vancouver, CBC Toronto, CBC Ottawa, and that show was, you had to be bright, you had to be quick, you had to be able to formulate your talking points. It was a real machine, and that is nothing like what you see today.
Yeah.
So that's where, and then 2011 happened, big blue wave. And I have to be honest, when you ask me about my background, it's hard not to remember, or kind of go back to those years and remember how I felt about my country and how I felt about my personal growth, my professional growth, and my wealth growth, the growth of my personal wealth. And as a single mother who's raised her child from infancy by myself, with not a lot of financial support, being able to hustle
Yeah.
and create wealth is very important to someone like me. I'm not saying it's not important to anyone else, but you know, the flip side of not having security is, especially in Vancouver, is not an option. And so when you ask me about that time, I was not only satisfied professionally, very happy with the trajectory of my personal life because I felt there was such a good balance, but I was very happy with the country, and I felt rich. And I don't want to say like millionaire rich, but I felt, I didn't feel
Sounds.
afraid. I
Yeah.
didn't feel afraid. And I wasn't worried for my country. And I'm not saying this because Stephen Harper and Gordon Campbell and Brad Wall were all in power with Klein. I'm saying this because this is, when I talk to my colleagues, this is the last time we remember feeling good too. So, and then of course I left CBC Power and Politics. So it was one of the best decisions I ever made. I think there's a terrible rumor out there that I was fired. I was not fired. I had 100% massive disagreement with Rosemary Barton. She took a lot of time to embarrass me, I think purposely embarrass me. Uh, she called me a misogynist on air. She teamed up with liberal pundits. This was not going to be, I love doing television. I love punditry. And I say that to be as honest and forthcoming as I can be. Why would I leave? I'm also was one of the only paid political pundits in the country. And believe it or not, that's a very good salary spot to be in. And you wouldn't, I felt forced out. Because by the time Trudeau arrives on the stage in about 2013, late 2013, early 2014, there's already the buzz that he's going to be the anointed man king or boy king for the Liberal Party. And I'll tell you, that's when CBC really shifted. And I think any of my colleagues on the left would be liars if they didn't recognize they benefited from that bias and that personal relationship that the host, Rosemary Barton, obviously had established with Trudeau. So I want to be careful. I don't slander Ms. Barton, but I think it's important to tell the truth. And I think the moment that people like myself, and I'm not saying I'm the best pundit in the world, but I'm not going to lie, I think I contributed a lot to that show. I brought something that no one else brought because I'm on the ground in Western Canada. I'm not, drinking from the Kool-Aid in Ottawa. And I'm a real conservative. I'm not going to make excuses for my opinion or my feelings like other conservatives or conservatives have done. And so I want to make it clear, leaving there, although it was a great opportunity because that's when I did my second trip to the United States. I'd been in the U.S. In the 90s, where we had transitioned from, I had worked, believe it or not, on the Clinton Gore campaign in 96, the re-election. Was invited to the inauguration then, and then I transitioned over to Bush. And because I was so young, I was just happy for the political experience. And I'll tell you, it was the best training ground in the world. And I learned a lot, and I really did enjoy my time on the Clinton Gore campaign. Obviously, I was so young, I didn't really have an understanding of the complexities of the policies they were putting out. But Clinton was what you would, he wouldn't, I don't feel he represents the Democratic Party today. He's very free trade. He's a globalization guy, but it was an incredible experience. And then right before the pandemic, or sorry, right after that first wave of the pandemic is when I went down to the United States. And then in between that and now, I've gone back 4 or 5 times, and I've worked in uh, 2 different firms, both based in Washington, D.C. And the first role I had was head of Canada U.S. relations. So, and I've sort of parlayed that into working on different Republican campaigns, advising Canadian business leaderships on where the opportunities are in the United States. Unfortunately, I've become more known for moving Canadian companies than helping them stay in Canada. And I don't feel particularly bad about it. I want I want entrepreneurs to have a chance. So that's my background. And yeah,
Very interesting. I've taken so many notes, and I think we could go for an hour already
I
on what you said. But one thing I kind of want to stop on is I'm from the West and I went to law school in Ottawa. So I had an opportunity for 3 years to get a little glimpse of Ottawa. And then obviously, when I was there with the convoy, it was a different reality. But I described Ottawa always as a bubble. And it's interesting to hear you say that. And I think for regular Canadians that, aren't that involved in politics, maybe haven't been to Ottawa, they don't even they don't have a sense that that's an isolated area. So maybe let's talk about that a little bit because you were there on the ground. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit more is what is a political pundit? Like I don't know exactly what that is. I've heard the term a lot. So like let's talk like to somebody that isn't as politically involved as you are, please, for those two
Okay,
topics.
well, I'll just start by mentioning that I actually lived in Ottawa and I called it purgatory. I described it as purgatory. It's an artificial environment. Uh, who is hired there and why they're hired, it just, it's not how the rest of Canada or anywhere else works.
Right.
I would say that even DC isn't like that. The number one, if you speak French, you have your number one way ahead of everyone else.
Okay.
If you're a Quebecer, that's an added bonus too. And then you add in the recent application of DEI, and there's no oxygen for a Western Canadian there. But I did fly back because of
But
my job.
before you move on, just why in DC isn't it so bad? Because that's one thing I would have said, isn't it the same in DC, for example? But what makes you gave those two examples?
Yeah. I would say that contrary to what people think about Washington, and even if it was a Democratic administration, um, Americans they will bend in, and there's a lot of advantages that were applied through DEI, and they are very aware of ensuring that African Americans and women and um, those who identify which way or the other are included, but it's not at the exclusion of professionalism, and it doesn't get stupid like it gets in Ottawa. I mean, the incompetency that I've seen even in the administrators' offices over the years. I mean, back in the Chrétien years when I first arrived in Ottawa, they used to have Western desks, or that's what we called them. I think it's different with Trudeau now. And I remember meeting an entire staff that barely spoke English. And I said, how are you Western desks? How are you Western advisors? Well, we're from Manitoba and we're Francophone, or we're from Winnipeg and we're Francophone. Okay, well, I'm sorry, but that's less than 1% of our population in Western Canada. And it's not an offense to the French language or the culture or the heritage or the importance of Quebec. But if you say that, because now in Trudeau land, it's immediately taken as an affront to their character, to their province, their language, their culture. That's not the case. I rarely saw a member of the First Nations community acting as an advisor outside of Indigenous Affairs, which it then unfortunately was called Northern and Indian Affairs. Um, I would point out, at that time I was representing communities like Fort St. John, Dawson Creek, just to name a few. I mean, I was sort of queen of northeastern BC at that time, and some smaller communities in Alberta. So I was there often, or I lived there, and I was often flying back. And I would come into these meetings with my mayors or whomever it was, and they couldn't pick where Dawson Creek was on a map because they had no understanding of Western Canada. Manitoba is not Western Canada. It's central Canada.
Yeah.
And I hate to burst the premier's bubble on that, but it's not a Western Canadian province in my mind. It's central Canada. And I think Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia would agree with that. So as you
Well,
can tell, I
look
was
at even the
impressed.
population of that one poor province. It's big and
Poor,
it has nobody in there.
poor Manitoba. Nobody subscribes. I mean, I say Ontario and Manitoba are central Canada. And then I think it becomes Eastern Canada once you hit Quebec. But I'm not a liberal and I don't have, under this world that we're living in, my vision of Canada is definitely not what is being portrayed. And I think if you ask a lot of Western Canadians, especially Saskatchewan, well, especially people in BC, probably more so than Alberta, Saskatchewan, ask them about their childhood watching the CBC. Did any of that make any sense to you? The imagery of,
Mm.
tapping maple syrup or snowy days, or um, there was no reference to British Columbia, if rarely.
Interesting. It just, I want to touch on that because it's so interesting you say that, because what the CBC constantly comes back to is that they have to be the voice of the greater Canadian in rural Canada. And yet, like you said, even the imagery that they are using is so from that very centralized part of Canada. They can't even reach their own imagery to get into rural or other massive parts of Canada like BC. So that's really interesting to note. The other thing I found was so interesting is the first word you said when you described Ottawa, when I pressed you a little bit more, was exclusion, to the exclusion of others.
Mhm.
And here, all we hear constantly from this party and this government is that they're so inclusive. Meanwhile, they're the biggest perpetrators of excluding their own citizens, their own Canadians from even being part of the government. So very interesting, those words.
I think it's dangerous, even more dangerous and insidious than Canadians understand. It's to the exclusion of competency.
Mm,
It's
yeah.
to the exclusion of being prepared for your job. Or, I mean, I don't want to bring in the conversation of Elon Musk and Doge, um, but if you were to do on a very professional way, not swayed by propaganda and outrage, but you were to take a very sharp knife to the core of Ottawa, I think Canadians, especially Western Canadians, because they've been on the butt of the joke, they've been the last to receive, they've been the last to be respected or considered. They're the first, we're used as a vehicle to pit others against one another and pit ourselves one another against one another. But if you took a very sharp knife to it, you would be absolutely horrified at the stupidity that is hired there. And I don't mean to be, I don't care about being mean anymore. I am absolutely disgusted by the incompetence. I will give you an example. I was in DC and I had asked, and we'll get into this a little later, but one of the problems Mr. Trudeau has, and he can lie to all of your faces all he wants, but he had started ghosting our allies. And I had worked, and I won't say what it was regarding, but it was a big deal. And the US government ended up buying the company that I was working with, and it was a national defense situation. And I had written a letter, not by hand, not by mail, sent the email to the staff and said, it's been 3 weeks and we haven't heard from you, and this company cannot survive in the Canadian market anymore. It's going to go broke and it will no longer be intellectual property that will be viable, right? It'll be spoiled because it has a very large national security element to it. And I think this is one that you should invest in or support or approve. Get it going. What I got back in return was liberal propaganda and a picture of the prime minister. I don't know if it was an accident, but it's something that we were so stunned, we just started to laugh. And I don't know where it is right now, but I do have I had it framed because as a reminder of the incompetence of this government. And I will say to any one of their cabinet ministers, especially the ones that are running for leadership, I will call them liars and I will point out all the mistakes that they've ever made. And I will point out why Mark Carney is a bad idea,
Mm,
by, you know, for many reasons. And we can get into that
yeah.
obviously a little bit later, but the incompetence, the exclusion of professionalism.
Yeah.
And you would be shocked if you walked through the offices and saw who was sitting there.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I saw it firsthand during the convoy because that's when you need competent people making responsible and smart decisions because there's a big announcement that lots of people are coming into the city. And then we didn't realize, because I was there on the ground during the protest, but then it was all in the public sphere and open during the Public Order Emergency Commission. And the first 3 weeks, we sat there being like, why are the protesters even part of this when it was just everyone pointing fingers at the other? One level of government pointing the finger at the other one, or same with the police services. And it was embarrassing to sit through that and watch that this is the competence of our nation's capital, Canada, on display for the world to see. I was embarrassed, so I saw it. And I want to have these conversations because as a Canadian, I'm not proud to say it. I don't think you are either, but we have to recognize the problem in order to solve the problem. We can't keep pretending like everything is okay. And if we just keep our heads down and are polite, everything will get better. We have to talk about these issues. So I'm really glad to hear that.
We're not polite. What we
Yeah,
are is passive aggressive.
I agree with you on
I
that.
mean, the sorry thing is passive aggressive. You
Yeah,
know, and I think Canadians have a very warped understanding of what they're up to right now. It's not patriotism.
yeah.
It's aggressive, targeted nationalism. And if they don't like what Elon Musk's doing, and nationalism is incredibly dangerous. It's full of propaganda, and if you want to call it fake news, that's the inherent sense of nationalism. It's the rise of Hitler, for example. Patriotism is something very different, but Canadians, it took foreigners to make Canadians be patriotic. Like it's shocking to me.
And it's not even patriotism, like you said. Like, it's so uncomfortable for me to see what's going on in Canada. And, the truckers were one thing because they were praised and, a little bit blue collared. And then, of course, you could just throw labels on them. But I was thinking back recently, so it was Jamie Salé was quite vocal, and she was literally the sweetheart of Canada, a figure skater. She is a tiny little thing. And then the smear campaign against her. And I'm like, okay, it's COVID. People lost their minds, whatever. But to see the same thing now happening to Wayne Gretzky, the Canadian hero, and it's like adults have lost their mind. This is not patriotism, like you said. This is, I don't even know what to call it.
Rabid.
Yeah.
Let's bring up Bruce MacArthur. Is it Bruce MacArthur or Bruce Arthur? He's a tepid
Yeah,
sports
I've
writer
seen.
for the Star. He has,
Sports writer?
yeah, well, he was a sports writer and he's turned himself into, I actually tweeted at him. I said, what business do you have? First of all, Mr. Gretzky is not a public figure. He's not yours.
Yeah.
He's not ours.
Yeah.
He's a Canadian and he's done his time. We had him out there like a show pony for 22 years. Even his wedding, we encroached upon his privacy there. He gives millions of dollars to charity and he makes millions of dollars go to charity that benefit Canadians every single day of the week. Bruce Arthur, I'm hoping it's not MacArthur, I think it's Bruce Arthur, is a former failed sports writer. Well, I guess failed sports writer, it would be a bit redundant to say those two things together, and then he's turned himself into a political columnist, which, as I said to him on Twitter, what political experience do you have apart from sitting in a chair and criticizing people? You may be able to write, and I just want to say this to you, Eva. Just think, if Pierre actually wins, in less than 12 months, guys like Bruce won't have a job because the Toronto Star will be gone, because the Canadian Media Fund will be gone. And this state-funded media pyramid scheme that's going on is going to be done and dusted, and Bruce will have to just apply himself to Twitter very, very hard, or get himself a YouTube channel. But I found it absolutely, I've seen Bruce beak off with Andrew Coyne I actually don't know what's happened to Andrew Coyne. That's not the guy I remember back in the 90s. You know, former uh, a former writer with the National Post, and I
Yeah.
remember the day the Post launched and how exciting it was to see a bit of competition out there. It was obviously a right of center paper. It was very business focused. These gentlemen do not reflect
Yeah.
who they once were at a different time. I think Twitter, unfortunately, has been the worst thing that's happened to journalists, but also the best thing for us to see is now we really know who they are,
Yeah.
and who they vote for and what they support. And they actually tell us who they're voting for, which I come from. One side of my family is a family of journalists in the UK and the United States. They are horrified by that behavior because, you know, if you're worth your salt and you're at the Wall Street Journal, for example, you're not going to tell your readers who you're voting for. I mean, what has happened to the fourth estate in Canada is it makes you want to cry. But yes, I did go after Bruce on Twitter because the point I was making was your drive-by shootings are cowardly. What you're doing is cowardly and you have no place to stand on. What you're standing on is falsehoods and, you know, self-congratulations. You are not Wayne Gretzky. He has done more for this country than you ever will. In fact, I could argue that what you've done to this country is abusive and you've divided us more. So I'll leave it at that. I could go on for hours about that, but I'm horrified and I'm upset and I'm even more mad at my country now when I see that stuff happen.
Well, I was going to use the word childish when I see it. It's so junior high, and I just am shocked that these are adults writing this in public. I saw a University of Ottawa professor, I think, write something about, I hope Wayne Gretzky has the worst night of his life. And I'm like, this sounds like you're 13 and you're jealous of a boy or something like that. It's just incredibly childish. And it goes back to when you were saying that you were on those shows and you guys were having these debates and these discussions. And it was like, where did that go, Elise? Like, that's the reason I'm doing what I'm doing. I had no interest in doing a podcast, but I'm hoping to show that adults in Canada can have conversations like adults and not be childish. So what happened then? And please still answer the political pundits,
Oh, yes.
because for those of us that aren't that involved, let us know what that exactly means, but also what's happened with those intellectual, interesting debates. And then obviously, no wonder people aren't watching and they don't have credibility anymore when they're acting like children. Like, it's not that hard to figure out.
Well, so three-part question there. I
Yeah.
will say that, so a pundit is a talking head or a commentator. I hate the word pundit. When I do punditry in the United States, we're called analysts, which I much prefer because my education, I put so much into my education and so much into my work ethic. I'm not what you see on TV in Canada anymore. And there's a reason I just turned down another outlet because there are several very, very problematic parts to what they are now asking us to do as pundits. But my job, it's not, a pundit shouldn't be, it's not going to be somebody that's coming out of the prime minister's office or a leader's office, which is where I sort of originated from at the start of of this career. But it's somebody that knows the party, it identifies as one partisan or another. For me, it's conservative. Um, and has institutional knowledge, obviously a communicator. I hope it's a communicator. I do see lots and lots of lobbyists, and I'll tell you, a communicator can be a lobbyist, but a lobbyist can't be a communicator. Um, but I'll also say this. When I was at Power, and I'll give CBC this to the day I die, the years of 2009 I was probably there 6 months, 7 months too long, quite frankly, but I hung on. Um, until about 2014, it was actually, I'll say that first year of Rosemary Barton replacing Evan Solomon, that is sort of where it then peters off and goes off the cliff. But I will say this. Thank God for Chris Hall and Evan Solomon. They were amazing to work with. The consummate professionals. They brought out that hunger for debate. There really was no boundaries. But you would get booed by your own colleagues. And as a conservative, you don't want to get booed by an NDP or like you went so low and it wasn't fact based. But we didn't shout at each other. It wasn't like American style punditry that you see there or commentary that you see there, but it was pretty damn close. There was a good cut and thrust. Um, we also prepared for our shows. That's, I think, a big difference. So if I was traditionally on Mondays, I was Fridays were left for just journalists to be part of that panel, but Monday to Thursday was the political panel, and they would always include a journalist. And I don't think the journalists got a lot of airtime because we're all talking over each other, but there were some high level communicators on those shows, some movers and shakers. I was the only one that was consistently brought in by satellite because I wasn't in Ottawa very often at that time. That's not where the center of my business universe was. And you do get punished, unfortunately, for that. You're not going to be on the general election night. You are going to do, like I did Alberta's elections, BC, Saskatchewan's. I did those, but you're never going to make the money that the Ottawa or Toronto people make. There is such a discrepancy there. It's extremely unfair. I will say though, I was the only one that was allowed to work for another media outlet. And while I also worked for Sun News when Corey Tenike had first opened that up, I also had a very good contract with Global News. And um, they were extremely fair in making sure that my location didn't prevent me from miss or didn't stop me from opportunities. So I've had great people in my life. Great people support me. I don't think I've ever gotten a chance to say thank you to both Chris and Evan, but I later joined him on his radio show when he was there. But it was fantastic. You had to be smart. You had to be prepared. We would get our notes going 3, 4 days before the shows. The executive producer or the executive producer, there's several producers underneath, and they are letting their pundits know. I don't know how they broke us out, but I had a producer I worked with. So it wasn't produced in the sense of I was told what to say, but it allowed us to make sure that we stayed very tight to the minutes we had, and that we were able to get the points across. We never shoved in more than three, front loaded topics like Indigenous affairs um, or national defense or the case of Russia. We never stacked them so much you couldn't actually have a fulsome debate. And that is no longer the case anymore. Nowadays, and I haven't watched Power and Politics, it breaks my heart because and by the way, I just want to say, um, I attended the press gallery dinner with Don Newman. And I remember, and I was there with Don Martin, formerly the host of Power and Politics or Power Play. And Don Newman was right beside me. And I was absolutely starstruck. I loved him. I've always loved him. And I used to watch his original show that evolved into Power and Politics. And I used to tell my mom that is where I wanted to be. I didn't want to be the host. I wanted to be the guest. And there was a woman by the name of Lynn Mayhew, who was a reform pundit. I wrote her a long letter several years ago thanking her because she really inspired me. And I don't know where she is today, but she worked with Harper. They created the Reform Party. Um, so to all the women that are out there like yourself, little girls do watch all of us, and some of them do aspire to be us. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing play out on Power and Politics now, I wouldn't let my own daughter join that. It is a falsified situation. It's artificial environment. We're not allowed to. One outlet has told me no eye contact and no rebuttal. I have to wait for the host to signal that that pundit has finished, and then I'm allowed to speak. I'm not allowed to say that actually, no, you're wrong. I'm not allowed to use aggressive language. Well, okay, what is the point? I'm supposed to go, oh, that's great. You made a really good remark. First of all, it might not even be truthful. And just because I'm partisan doesn't mean I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So it's not an environment I would want to ascend to now. I think Vashi on CTV, uh, the new host of Power Play. I think she's fantastic. I can see why she left the CBC and took the helm of that show. That makes perfect sense. I do think their pundits, well, they're just what CBC had for many years. Not a lot of change there. They're not inspiring, I think, new voices to come forward there either. And the country really needs a strong Western Canadian base of pundits. I don't care if you're NDP, Liberal, or Conservative, you need to get out there. And also the way that we see conservatism in this country from a Western Canadian perspective plays out very differently across British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. A lot of it is very social credit in the West too, of how we identify as conservatives, right? With a tinge of reform somewhere in there as well. And I think that I think the Conservative Party actually should spend a lot more time honing the skills of they don't even have to be young people, but honing the skills of a diverse group of Western Canadian commentators, because one singular or two singular voices or two voices isn't I think enough to be able to really show off the caliber that we have compared to liberals.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting what you're saying too about how there's those all those rules for having a discussion and doesn't make sense, obviously. Like you should be welcome to have a discussion and have a reasonable debate about things without those kind of rules. You're all adults. Like that should be the one rule. Act like an adult. Um,
If you
but
roll tape with me in 2014 or 2013, you'll see me actually raising my voice at this NDP, Ian Capstick, I think was his name. And I might be wrong if it was Ian, but he literally called me some sort of what was quite a kind of a sexist comment. I know it was cut and thrust and all's fair in love and politics, right? But you'll see me go, actually, Evan, I need one more second. Let me tell you how this is going to go. And this is
yeah,
what we stand for. That would be considered abuse today in the
yeah.
zeitgeist. Yeah.
And meanwhile, we have people acting a lot worse on like, social media or even the way our elected officials and the media. I'd like to ask you that too, because I find the way the media asks questions of elected officials is incredibly childish right now too. And I don't know whether that was the case before, or maybe I'm exaggerating how it is, but I don't see them trying to actually solicit and get information out of the elected officials there. It's like so much to the trying to get that gotcha moment that it's, again, incredibly childish. It's not benefiting anyone, including their own ratings. And that was the third part of the question,
Yeah.
is which I think kind of just is a natural response to how everything's gone. People don't want to watch this childish behavior, this where you can't actually express your opinion. So anyway, if you could give me your thoughts on how, like, was that how the media asked questions before, like when you were around, Stephen? And what? Yeah, okay. So you're
I would
saying
say,
no.
so even in a very premier friendly province like Saskatchewan, and I would say the Regina Leader, I think it is one of the best papers that Canada still has going, and it rarely gets an acknowledgement. Um, but even with at that time very pro Brad Wall, like I mean, he was going to always win his elections. It was just by how much. And I was there. He asked me to come out in his last election run, and coincidentally at that time, Stephen Harper was resigning, and unlike Trudeau, actually resigned, and the first Liberal or the first Conservative leadership was going to be held in May of the following year. And of course, at that point, my role of being there was really more about having a discussion with several other of his advisors, or a few of the other advisors, and Brad about, oh my God, you're running in this election campaign, but people want you to run for the leader of the Conservative Party. And I put it on the record, I always thought it was a bad idea. I felt like Brad Wall and what Brad Wall embodied would hit the atmosphere in Ottawa and just break into particles. He wouldn't survive that, and it would ruin his career. And I'm really glad he made the decision to step away, because Brad Wall couldn't have survived the chaos and comedy, and it was a punchline at all of our expense in the last 5 years. This DEI, this total lack of focus of what was important, and then what the commitment actually is between those we elect to serve us and us. You know,
Mhm.
but I will say it was pretty cut and thrust. If you look at Power and Politics today, I don't watch it because there's a level of not enough experience on there. You can see why they've chosen the people on there, because they visually reflect what they think the country wants to see, which as a woman and who got my role there as a Western Canadian conservative woman, I understand that and I appreciate that that door opened. And by the way, there was a lot of white guys from the NDP, Liberals, and Tories that hated me because I was on constant rotation. I mean, no joke, 13 to 15 shows a week might have been a low point at one point. But there also has to be competency. And not once did I demonstrate, apart from maybe having a bad day, did I not show up fully prepared, ready to go. And as a woman, I had to put it all together. Even I had to get the hair and the makeup and, and I had to show up whether I was feeling it or not, and I have to be honest, sometimes what you didn't see on TV was my little girl right at the chair below us. So, you know, none of these people that I see now, I think, have experienced adversity in the truest, harshest sense. They also don't have any institutional knowledge. They don't even look at each other as they're talking. They're just sort of I can't watch it because it's just so bloody stupid. And it's so beneath what the show was. And I was so proud of the contribution. The other part, the question of journalists, yes, it started to get really stupid about 4 or 5 years ago. But part of what's happened there, and I noticed this in about 2011, Twitter is really heating up at that point. Lots of people have joined. When I joined, I think I had a conversation. I think there were like 16 people that I was talking to in 2008. And I'm thinking, why am I off Facebook? Why am I on Twitter? And then a year later, I was like, this is why I'm on Twitter, right? And it was fun. And as communicators, you build strategies to kind of take out your opponents on Twitter, and you could do it because nobody had sort of seen the tradecraft like that before. But around 2011, 2012, and any journalists watching this, if they do watch it, they can correct me. But that's when the publishers and executives laid a heavy burden on, especially the younger, newest staff members. A Gary Mason from the Globe and Mail is never going to be asked to do what these now older millennials were asked to do, which is, number one, you got to tweet, you got to write your story, and if you're not writing it, it means that you're in the medium of television. And then what we need you to do is you need to set up a tripod, interview yourself, put it all together, and then sort of get out there. And by the way, Twitter rules, don't worry. They hadn't even had an idea around exposing so much content that they were losing paid subscribers. But I felt very bad for the journalists. A lot of them, there was a lot of pink notices that were put out to the old guard of the newspaper world at that time, and we lost a lot of good talent. They were just the way that the publishers and the media executives felt was that why pay for these guys when you could get 5 more young people underneath them, right? Maybe a couple of interns and then a couple of young journalists to start. And they literally would be walking around with backpacks with a tripod and their cell phone that they were recording another interview on. They looked harried. They're coming in that way with no institutional knowledge. I remember probably the question I've been asked the most when I've been interviewed about resources in this country is about softwood lumber. You'd think it would be pipelines, but it's actually about softwood lumber. And I always ask the journalists, do you know anything about the war in the woods? Do you know anything about BC in the 90s? No. Their world starts around 2012. So they don't have a strong understanding of the softwood lumber agreement, why some of this is becoming especially problematic now. And by the way, that bias you see, so you tee up a Mark Carney interview with what happened with Pierre last week. You can see the difference. You can see the partisanship. You can see them looking for a gotcha moment with Pierre. Yes, there was a strong bias against Harper when his stars started to fade and Trudeau's landed on the national scene. The journalists by far are socialist, extremely left-leaning. You're not going to find a middle-of-the-road soft, sort of red Tory type in there. Traditionally, by the vast majority, they are on the hard left. I don't want to say hard left because that's also changed now. That includes people that support terrorism. But, they are lefties and they like subsidies. They like that the taxpayers paying their salaries now. they like all of that. And
Well,
now we're in a
yeah.
conundrum.
The part I don't get is sure you like the subsidies, okay, but then recognize that you have to provide content that the people providing the subsidies actually enjoy, or that you have to have some credibility to those that are providing the subsidy. Like, that's the disconnect I don't understand with them at all. Like, I'm not asking for people to like my content, but it's happening more than these people that have these established, that's their job, is to communicate, and they can't do it because they're so entrenched, I think, and like I said, acting like children instead of adults. And
They've got a
I
God complex.
is that what it is?
I find that if you talk to Andrew Quinn, I haven't spoken to Andrew in years now, but and Gary Mason is the king of this. I was so put off by something he said to me a few years ago, so upset about it because I had a lot more respect for him. I think when you meet some of them and
Yeah.
the young communicators start to actually have to wrangle them and hold the line, you really see what you're up against. It's no more nicey nicey, and it can be uh, quite shocking how brutal it really can be, especially when you get the entitlement piled on. And I don't remember seeing a female uh, old school reporter as arrogant as some of these guys I've just mentioned. The sense of entitlement that they're what they say goes and there should be no question about it. There's no coincidence that they're all opinion writers. And I believe at least a few of them have written some books. But when I look at someone like Lawrence Martin, for example, who back in the Chrétien Ottawa years was considered to be very well respected, and he's managed to carry that through. I disagree with someone like him all the time, but it hasn't changed my level of respect for him. That's the difference now, Eva. That is the difference. The veil is being lifted far too often for me. I know what they're thinking, what they really feel about the people that I work around or the people I believe in to run my country. I can't shake that. With Lawrence Martin, I suspected he was a liberal. I knew he kind of liked Chrétien, and I could understand why. And I personally had a fantastic relationship with Paul Martin. I think that's something that half of Ottawa knows about. Had a really good relationship with him. Was happy to have I worked with him through a contract at Finance Canada, so I was very happy uh, to not only just get to know him professionally, but personally as well. He is what he is. But he's not meant for this political world anymore. But I could tell Lawrence Martin had that connection, and that was okay. But that's not the same as what's happening now. I think one of the reasons why Paul Wells jumped out of Twitter, now X, was that he couldn't be what he was at Maclean's and he couldn't be what he was at the National Post back in the day. It was, yes, he's a lefty, and I knew Paul very, very well in the late 90s. We actually dated, but he's going to love that I mentioned that. But I didn't agree with his politics, but it never stopped me from respecting his
Well,
craft.
well, one thing I just wanted to say too is, because I think I'm speaking more from a perspective of Canadians that aren't that in and knowledgeable about all of these pundits and political figures, is some of the I don't know who those two people are, and yet, like, it sounds like
You know why you probably don't? Because they're not playing the game that what you're seeing, what like Bruce is doing or Andrew's doing on Twitter.
well,
And
yeah. Well,
yeah,
but the thing is that I'm coming from it, at least I could speak for myself, from a humbled place. Like, I am not seeking for anybody's approval or recognition. I put my own thoughts and views on things. And this is where it just sounds like what you're saying is, especially with the ego coming into it, that they want to be that voice and they want that megaphone, and they don't have it right now. And that's very difficult for them. So then the only way to get it is if you write something that's very divisive, or instigates a lot of views, like a childish comment would. So I don't think that's the best we can offer in Canada. I'm wondering how we do better. That's always also what I look at. Like, there's a lot of problems. We could probably talk about those for a long time. But I was looking at how Pierre Poilievre sometimes responds. And I think that it's really hard often to respond. I see the same thing too with Danielle Smith here in Alberta. She gets these constant like attacks and gotcha questions, and it doesn't help the convert. Like, I'm not looking for that. I don't look at it as much. But how do you think that they can respond, elected officials, to kind of get a conversation that is more respectful and more fruitful for Canadians or Albertans in the case of Premier Smith? Like, do you think there's a way that elected officials can address it? Because I think it was fun, Pierre Poilievre with the apple, but I don't think that should be his shtick every time. I think that these people need to be called out for being children sometimes. I don't know. Like, that's kind of how I feel watching it.
I think I want to give Danielle Smith a lot of credit here because I first met her when she was leader of the Wild Rose Party.
Mhm.
And the misogyny that that woman has put up with is shocking. She came up like a phoenix from the ashes. I mean, love her or hate her, I don't care, but you have to goddamn respect her. She has earned that spot. And she is your premier. I don't care if you think you're the next best thing at the Calgary Herald or
Yeah,
whatever it is.
great
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
That is
This is
supreme.
a mutual respect game. And the moment you break it is the moment that somebody like me as a media wrangler would say, that's it, get the freaking heck out
Yeah,
of here. I would pull a Trump press secretary, and I have. I
yeah.
pulled what the Trump's press secretaries pulled. I've said, no way, no how, you're not getting in. I also think one way that, here's the thing that's happening in media. What you're seeing with the Andrew Coynes and all of that chest thumping that goes on, and you're right, how they're crafting their columns, right? It's all rooted in tribalism. And I think what they saw was, especially around the convoy and around people like yourself, is that you're driving big numbers that they wish they could drive. They are stuck in, yes, I love print journalism, but I'm not buying the newspaper. And I recognize that that's something that they refuse to sort of, it's going to stay that way for a little bit while longer. But that print, literal print version kind of demonstrates the mindset that the publisher is still in. The only person, the only publisher that has managed to really pull off the transition was the Wall Street Journal and Gerard Baker. I think he's a king of his time there, and he's not had to lay off his people, and he's not had to put these arbitrary paywalls down. I have, there's different things that he's done that have not only rapidly increased the readership, but opened his paper up to a whole new younger audience as well. Canadians are very provincial, and I don't mean that to be a pun. They are very provincial in their thinking. But
Mm.
getting back to the coins and all and that group, that rodeo on Twitter, they saw the rise of the right of center and how they were using YouTube, Twitter, Instagram Live, I've forgotten what Twitter Live is called now. X Live, I guess, is what it is.
Spaces.
Yes. And all of you were amassing large amounts of viewership. Eyeballs were coming to you. And there are some, like True North as well, has done extremely well. There's a reason why people like myself, who never thought I'd give up on legacy media, has gravitated towards people like yourself. I realized by about 2017, 2018, there was this whole world of people that I didn't recognize because I was so forward facing into the CBC Ottawa political commentator, work for
These
the,
names
yeah,
you were mentioning.
yeah, all these self-appointed, technically know-it-alls along with me.
Canadian kings.
Yeah, yeah, they, if you were an Ottawa-based reporter, I definitely knew you, right? But I didn't know, and I can't think of anyone off the top of my head. But if you look at who I subscribed to on YouTube, and you compared to what that looked like in 2018, it's so different. I'm also following US younger Republicans and their YouTube pages, and
Yeah,
I'm excited about it. And I never thought I would take that turn because I always sort of looked down my nose at it. Well, you're not on CBC, you're not on CTV, you're not on Global, then why are you talking? But
yeah,
then, but then you see, 129,000 followers or 18,000 people have watched this. And you think, oh
yeah.
my goodness, who are these people? And
But
I
it's
think the moment you rose,
yeah.
that's when they started to really bare their teeth and go tribal, and they're looking to grow a next generation of what would be people a little bit old, like the baby boomers, that are still hanging on. They're hoping to get a next generation out of them that will stay committed and listen to the Coins and the Bruces of this world, and you know, that whatever, that babble that goes on. And also, I think a lot of Canadians now recognize that that those two individuals amongst, when they're just two people amongst a large group of others, that Canada that they write about does not exist.
Yeah.
Maybe in Newfoundland and Quebec and in the Ottawa greater area, but it's not anywhere else.
Yeah. Interesting. When I went to the convoy, it was, I had probably 1,000 followers. And then I remember right before going to the Public Order Emergency Commission, I was excited that I had 3,000. And it just goes to show how much Canadians, the greater population, was looking for something, some information. So that's one thing. It's interesting that you mentioned that. But yeah, like the convoy itself, the people that were making those presentations and those calls, they were getting insane amount of numbers. And I can totally see where legacy media was trying to
You
like
changed it.
drive it.
You, Eva, and your colleagues also made where I was at that time obsolete. I became obsolete. I was old. You know, I was in my 40s and I was like, what? How did I miss this boat? Right. Um, but, and I knew the country was angry. And what I had always tried to do was sort of polish up. There's a horrible way I want to say it, but I won't say it like that. Polish up Western Canada's anger and, you know, the things that we've had to put up with in order to make it digestible on CBC. And I used to take some flack from conservatives. I can't believe you're on the CBC. Blah, blah, blah. You should get off. Well, no, because then I'm giving up free advertisement. I'm giving up a spot
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
conservative. And a liberal will just take it, or someone who pretends to be conservative.
Yeah.
And they'll do an even worse job. So, but you guys were going guns a-blazing. You're like, this is who I am. This is where the country is. It sucks. Um, and that is part of the reason why I think Ottawa public hated you guys, because they are the establishment liberal voter. They're the reason why Trudeau's in
Yeah.
and went in 3 times. They are to blame for everything that's happened in the last few years. They are some of the most selfish, self-righteous people I've ever met. Everything that you were and your friends and colleagues were at the convoy was a complete affront to their senses. And I'll tell you what really the threat is. They are going to lose power and you're going to gain power. That's what this is all about. And it's like that with Coin and
That's
Bruce
right.
and yeah, it's about power. They don't want to hand over what they believe they have the right to they have the right to inherit.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what it is.
It's interesting with you said the Ottawa public, because when I was there, there was a lot of Ottawa public that was just so supportive as well. So I mention that all the time, but it's that establishment and the power grabbers. I can totally see that. What is interesting when you were talking about the Republicans on YouTube, you said, why are you talking? And to be perfectly honest, that's kind of how I feel about the Rosie Bartons, the Andrew, when I see who are they and what is their background? Like they have, I don't know anything about their background except for I know that they were kind of plucked from somewhere and thrown onto the CBC, on to the biggest like TV state broadcaster we know. But I have no interest, because that's my question when I watch it. Why are you talking? What is your background? What is your knowledge? Who are you to tell me? You don't even look like you should be on the television. I'm very sorry to say that too, because you did mention, like, let's look like we deserve to have this opportunity to speak to the nation. Sometimes when I watch these legacy media, it's like in their closet or something. I don't know what's happening. So that's my reaction to the legacy media. Why are you
I
talking?
love it. I love it.
Why do you think you can tell me anything and you think
Eva,
I'm going to listen? So
Eva,
it's just,
imagine being on air and looking at one of those people or all of them at one particular time that you're referencing. And I'm on air and I'm thinking exactly what you're thinking. But I have to say to my brain, stop, because you have to listen to what they're saying because they're going to be wrong and you're going to need to fix it. and
hilarious. Yeah.
yeah, and then worse off, one of them could be your host, right? And you're looking at them going, you you're something else. You
Yeah.
really are, but you got to go with the show. So I, that's maybe why I can't watch programs
Yeah.
like that as well, because I know it's kind of like looking behind the curtain. I know the abuse that some people take. But if you think about it, there's no real, apart from Corey Tonight on, CTV with Vashi. Um, and she does deserve being there. She's a great host and I'm very happy for her. And I don't want to sound patronizing by saying I'm proud of her, but I think she's amazing. I can only imagine the crap that she had to put up with at CBC. And I mean, there is a reporter, as you might be following Catherine Marshall, the lawyer Catherine Marshall. She's representing a CBC reporter I knew very well. Well, not very well. I don't want to overstate or overemphasize that and mislead you, but I knew Travis relatively well in my gaggle of media. And I think he interviewed me at least several times. Um, I spent a lot of time with him actually during the Ontario Conservative or PC's leadership race that Doug Ford won. And now he is suddenly being put on leave. And I don't know if you know this story, but I wrote an entire tweet and it was probably, it shouldn't be that long. It's kind of, I would say, you know, if you're going to write something, email that, but I wanted him to hear it. I was actually surprised. He started following me about a week before I saw this story and I thought, oh, I haven't seen Travis in ages. Now I kind of figure I kind of understand why he might be following me because this story is starting to erupt. And I would get your viewers and listeners to follow Catherine Marshall on Twitter. She's a lawyer. She's an amazing advocate for the very injustice that you and I are talking about that's happening to Canadians and to those who have differing opinions of the CBC, which essentially is a PR factory for Justin Trudeau.
Uh-huh.
And I know they get offended by that, but listen, let's just call it. Let's just
It's
call
so
time of death
obvious.
on this.
Come on. It's, yeah, like, it's just obvious.
I
Let's,
mean, their convoy coverage, I was on air during those months or weeks. I was I was sort of bullied into shutting up. You know, people don't really understand. It doesn't represent Canada. It represents somebody in Ottawa in an office that this is their fever dream of Canada. And that's what the CBC is. And I just also want to state this because I want Canadians to understand that what's happened there has been so toxic and destructive.
Mhm.
There are at least two producers, excuse me, executive producers that I've worked with who, who supported me, who pushed me to go further. And one of them actually advocated that myself and another pundit, who was an NDPer, be on the election desk. They didn't want two women on the election desk. They wanted it to be how they traditionally do it and then have us little as side chicks talking about what we know our former bosses were gonna do and what the outcome was. But this particular producer pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And those were the years that things really started to go downhill for the CBC. Within 6 months, she was gone to another network.
Yeah.
And I really missed her when she left. So, excuse me. So I want to say that it was a takeover of the CBC, but I love what you said. Who are these people and why are you talking? And with the
Yeah.
Republican guys, I actually think they're amazing. I was turned on to them because people at GOP events were talking to me about them. Have you seen one of Nikki Haley's campaign staffers said, you got to see these guys. And through that, what unearthed, was these Canadian YouTubers. Now, I will tell you, there's a couple of out there that have an enormous subscription base and they are, I think, poison. They're awful. they're not conservatives. They're just angry white dudes in hockey jerseys. And I'm not interested in that type of punditry. That's not punditry. That's just, well, it's bullshit, Eva. And it's destructive and it's toxic. And it's the flip side of the same coin that you and I are complaining about with the CBC. I'd like to see those guys go. What is it? Maple syrup MAGA guy. He needs to go.
I don't even know most of these. Again, I feel like I live in my own world and I just put my content out and let people either enjoy it or disagree.
No,
But yeah,
I
yeah,
think you're very much, and this isn't because I'm on your show, but I think you're very much the future. You're in a very enviable position because one thing that my pundits on the other side never had that I always maintained was door knocking. I know who's in my community. I know what people need. I don't care if it's my government that has messed you around or the liberals. I'm going to say what I'm going to say and I'm going to mean it every single time. And I'm going to say this is wrong. That is what you are as well. And that's the advantage you have. You can't fake that. And, you know, in this DEI world, we talk about authenticity. Well, that is truly authentic. And you know who your audience is. I think you understand what the country wants. The stories that you tell are incredibly interesting. Um, and I think that you're on an excellent path. And I think what you're feeling and what you're seeing out there is that tribalism that's rooted in jealousy. And remember that type of poison pen that those guys are putting out there is really anger, and anger is just fear, and the fear is losing the power. They
yeah,
know that they do not have the nation's attention anymore. And because you didn't have the wonderful experience I had of living in Ottawa, i.e. purgatory, you don't understand how much power they used to wield.
yeah. Well, like I said, I was in law school in Ottawa, and I know it's a very different experience. But I was so like I'm not tribal, first of all, so I didn't even think about that when I was there. But then looking back, I do recall people kind of shaming me from being from the West. And I recall that now looking back more, but I was like, whatever, like I'm here, I'm in law school, I was excited. So it's interesting that and you saw it, like the people that were in law school, it was politics this, and I know Martin, or I'm on Kretsch, and like they were so involved. And that was good. But then when it turns to tribalism and it's gone to what it is now, that's where we've gone too far now, and we need to start acting like adults again. To me, it's again, like I said, very high school. I do want to go back to one thing that you talked about right from the start, and it was you feel that there's stagnation in Canada. And maybe we could talk about this and end it on this, because you said in your personal life, professional life, years ago, you felt growth. And I think that was how the country felt. And it's interesting you said it, stagnation in Canada. And then I don't think you said it, but maybe there's also stagnation in your personal and financial life. And I think I can speak for Canadians as well. I think that's what a lot of Canadians are feeling. You did mention it before that, you were making pretty good money, but it was still hard to enjoy because we're always working. So how do you think we can get over this hump? What do you see happening? How can Canada get shaken out of this like la la land that we're in and recognize we've got serious problems, and more so we have a lot of work to do to correct those problems?
I want to just tell a little story to highlight the truth behind this versus truthiness versus it being a feeling of mine. It's not. I'd been banging on the drum about 5 years ago about this because when I first took off to the States, I kept my house in the West but I wanted to take some files and I happened to stumble across in my garage sort of what I call the 2009 to 2017 years. And they're in these legal boxes, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And you put your dividers in and I have notebooks like this
Yeah.
and they're dated. And I started putting those together by about 2008 and it has all of my punditry notes in it. And I probably go through one a week. And so there's quite a lot of them and I refuse to get rid of them. But when you look at the issues from 2009 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, so on and so on. To this very day, they are the same discussion points I was having on and off TV with the premiers if I was working with them, or with the clients if I was on the private sector side. It is the same issues. Nothing in this country gets resolved. We do a lot of picking fluff out of our navel. We make excuses, but what our lack of ambition is just pure laziness. And there are some bright sparks in our universe. There are the founders of Shopify. But as they would tell you, as they said in a recent interview, they would not have built their company in Canada if they were to do it again. And that is why 12 of, I think, some of the greatest companies I have taken to the United States. And we have lost out on proprietary game-changing technology in aviation because of that. We've lost out on much needed prescription research and development around certain prescription drugs, around Alzheimer's and epilepsy and other things. We've missed out on, we've actually said no to large corporations because we've said, well, we're not going to have a football field named after an energy company or whatever it is, or we're not going to do business with an oil and a pipeline company because, well, they're pipelines and that's bad. We've done other things like, people like myself and clients that I have, and you bring them in from DC or from all parts of the United States, and you say, okay, these are the goalposts. But for the last almost decade, what you thought was this on a Monday was this on a Tuesday. I'm not joking when I talk about staffs ghosting CEOs and allies. It is no joke. We were actually, about 5-6 years ago, I was at a diplomatic dinner in DC, and it included the Brits, the Germans, the French, the regular crowd. And these are very interesting, intellectual people. And they would, after a few drinks, and people sort of start loosening up, they said, do you speak Trudeauese? What's he talking about? Like, I feel like Alise, he talks and he doesn't give me answers. Plus, I should fully uh, disclose that I worked and advised the UK and their ambassador or their embassy or consulate from 2009 to, I believe, 2016. So there's a disclosure there. So I knew a lot of people in the diplomatic circle. Plus, DC was a town I thrived in. And if you like politics and policy and grown-up conversations, that's really where you want to be. And that's the first time I heard anyone outside of my conservative circle in Canada highly critical. And what concerned me was that it was coming from allies, and allies we had made very firm commitments to.
Right.
And Trudeau had not only just ghosted them, but he had backtracked on these incredibly important agreements for clean energy with the UK, with the exploration of minerals, things that we can now see. If you speed up very quickly, you can see, oh my goodness, like the cost of living crisis in the UK. We could have done something about that. We are much more on the hook for the world's problems than Canadians could ever imagine. And Trump doesn't have to bend to us. You're Canadian. He's the president of the United States. And the very things that he's been complaining about, we've had several, and you know this as a lawyer, we've had the money laundering commission in BC. We've had the RCMP investigation into Chinese influence, not the one in Ottawa, the one in British Columbia. This all started 8 years ago in BC. We knew what we were doing, but those baby boomers and those politicians were just, give me more money. It's okay. It'll all work out. It's a shell game we've played, and we started playing it with the international community, and that is part of the stagnation. We haven't made any decisions. Companies have walked away. Our private sector in North America has essentially just walked away from us.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult to try and bring anyone back. Good example. So, and a story that I do want to tell you because I think this exemplifies the problem with Justin Trudeau.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in Washington, and it would have been 2021, Biden was putting together what I lovingly call the G7 Digital Sales Act. And it was very hard to bring everybody on board. And his co-pilot was the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And unfortunately, her name escapes me. She was extremely
Jacinda.
popular. Yes. And they managed to get everybody on side, including the GOP. And Biden had a very tenuous hold on this group. Trudeau and Canada, of course, were part of it, and Trudeau had agreed to sign off. And I was in DC this day, and we joke now that I could hear Biden screaming from my office to the Hill. Trudeau had decided to impromptu make an announcement that he was going his own way to put the digital sales tax in. At that moment, when Trudeau crossed Biden started litigating all the reasons he was never going to trust him again, and that how many times he had made an excuse for Trudeau. And Biden had spoken to him about the border and sort of did not have that strong arm approach that Trump has. So Trudeau, being the master manipulator, was able to wiggle out of a lot of those meetings, that communication, or just ghost Biden. But the Digital Sales Tax Act, the Global Digital Sales Tax Act, was a marquee policy position for Biden, along with, and if you remember correctly, at that time, Biden was starting to threaten the energy companies as well. So he had two big files coming together. The energy side was incredibly unpopular, but people kind of liked the idea of a digital sales tax, global digital sales tax. So there was no market that the big titans could play against one another. That was the way to capture them. When Canada went on its own, Biden was furious, and that began sort of a reawakening of where I think the U.S. wanted to be with Canada, because Trudeau really screwed over Biden. And then they knew that they had a short time, because a lot of those leaders in that group were going to be facing election. And sure enough, they started to fall one by one for conservative leaders, and they were not interested in doing a digital sales tax. I have many other stories like that, Eva. And this, to have the global sales tax, digital sales tax, would be one thing, but it doesn't work when it's a Canadian digital sales tax. And I think what Biden was absolutely astonished by was that he was going to use the funds to create paychecks for those who work as journalists and reporters. That to him was, I remember talking to somebody from ABC News who was a bestie of mine, and we were having drinks, and she was telling me what this Biden staffer we both knew was saying. They were like, what's with the communist stuff that's happening in Canada? It's crazy to do that. And if there wasn't going to be what I call the G7 Act, or G7 Digital Sales Tax Act, then the best thing Canada should have done is said, look, we're not going to force you to pay taxes. We're going to force you to invest in real tech centers, because Amazon shipping and handling facility is not a tech hub. And in the United States and the United Kingdom, it is unusual, more so obviously in the United States, to have every announcement come from government. In Canada, Canadians think that's normal. These announcements are coming from Hewlett Packard, Google, Amazon, all generated independently from government. That is not what's happening in Canada. But, Trudeau blew up a lot of relationships, and I think Canadians need to understand. And this is why I think it's good that Pierre Poilievre has been able to, I think, damper expectations to a realistic level, because we are in a recession. There are things that are happening that prevent the full exposure, but we're there. Stagnation, lack of productivity, and this very strange situation we've been in with our allies and foreign investment community for a long time. Those are very big problems that will take a few years to work out. In fact, somebody like Pierre needs 3 terms to actually undo 8-9 years of Justin Trudeau. And unfortunately, it just won't happen, I think, in our country. But that's sort of where we're at. And I have to say, I'm very disappointed in Canada. I've never felt more disconnected from my country.
Well, and so it really interesting, because it does sound like there was a lot of, like, right now, Canada with other countries and with businesses is obviously not regarded well. That seems pretty clear. Pierre Poilievre, it sounds like you have hope that he could make change, and it will require 3 terms, for example. But do we need even like a stronger message, or do you think that will take time for Canadians to warm up to that? Because I agree that I'm not pleased with where Canada is, but I always ask the chicken and the egg question. Is it because Canadians aren't involved, or why is it that we're in the situation that we're in? Is it going to, when Pierre Poilievre comes in, can we just let him do his thing, or do Canadians need to be involved? Is it the fault of the media? Why is it that we're in this position? And then, really, how do we fix it?
I compare it. So when I was
Pressure.
coming of age, it was the early 90s. And as you know, Chrétien had been elected. I can't remember if I was 17, 18. I can't even remember how old I was then. But I remember that was when I knew I wasn't going to go into journalism. That was where I originally was going to go because there was just red tape and red pen all over the place in Canada. But what was different was there was this sense that we were going to come out the other side. There was some hopefulness, but and I also took off to the States as well then. So, I was able to sort of get around it, but it was nothing compared to what my parents had dealt with in the early 80s, for example, especially in Western Canada, which I think a lot of people will remember, or the energy crisis, for example. But there's something quite insidious about what's happened now. It's layering and layering of lies, and
Yeah.
Canadians are not ambitious or thoughtful enough. And I hate to say this, they are not, they don't, I don't know if they don't care or they don't know what to ask or if they just, I don't know what goes on in this country because it is so different from the United States. I don't
Yeah.
care if you could be in your poorest county in Kentucky and you'll go and drive through there and go to the local, oh, I've forgotten the name of their 7-Eleven type convenience store. And you could be talking to somebody, poor is poor is poor, dirt poor. But they know exactly when the local elections are. They know when who their state senators are. They know, they may be wrong, but they have a very strong opinion of how they see the world. They're very engaged. It's
Yeah.
not as elitist as one may think. But if I walk down the street in Vancouver, and Vancouver in the media world is known as a place where you do not want to do streeters during elections unless you really have to. And a streeter is when you ask somebody walking past you, who are you voting for today? Who do you think will be do
Yeah.
you know how many takes it takes for any of these outlets to get somebody who can actually name who's
Um,
running?
yeah.
It's embarrassing, but I mean, I think Canada's getting what it deserves. I think Canadians are getting, they're going to have their backs broken for them to change. But will it be changed? Like this whole flag waving thing, it's going to be over in what, 6 weeks, right? I mean, the irony, and I think that the best sort of way to tie a bow on this Canada's not for sale thing is look at how much it cost to make that hat in Canada. And it wasn't even made in Canada eventually. It's
Yeah.
$60 for a stupid hat that he doesn't have a trademark to.
Yeah.
Then, and he's making a fortune off of one of the worst crises. And it's not a Donald Trump crisis. And it's not about Canada not being for sale. And I wish, and as much as I have worked around the Trump organization as an advisor on energy in his first term, I by no means am blind to idiocy. And I would wish Mr. Trump would just shut up about the 51st state because I know he doesn't mean it. What he really wants is a deal on our critical minerals. And I wish he would just shut up about it because he's actually making life really hard. And I actually wanted to write a letter to him or an email to his staffer the other day saying, you realize the more you do this, you're confusing the little Canadian brain. And they're going
Yeah.
to vote for a Mark Carney. And you're going to end up with 8 years more of the same garbage that you wanted gone. Don't believe what Carney's saying. It's going to
Yeah.
this is not time for another liberal government. So I can't answer the question. I'm not trying
I
to
think
say
you
that
did, though.
Canadians are stupid, but they're awfully juvenile.
Well, I think you did. And it's really interesting that you said in Kentucky, in the middle of nowhere, people, because that is after I kind of started to see the discussions and the arguments in Canada, I was a bit embarrassed that everyone was yelling about something and most of them are wrong, especially with legal things. So that's why I've put a huge focus on getting educated first and then involved. Although I think both are important because we need people involved, but educating Canadians is so important. So that's a massive focus of mine. And I think that does answer a lot of maybe why we're stagnated, because people don't know the questions to ask or who to ask or how to ask. And I didn't realize it was such a hindrance, but I'm seeing it a lot now. So, and I think people, and this is why I think I'm getting, engagement and lots of, following and things like that, because I'm making that available. And I think the people that are gaining voices are making it available. It's not a top down approach. And maybe that's how legacy media was. We're going to tell you. Right now, it's more like, here's information so that you can rise up. And I think that that's a much better way for Canadians to move forward and hopefully get out of that stagnation. Because I'm with you.
It's
It's,
also, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think it's also part of legacy media's downfall, and I don't know if it's because of them, because they co-signed off with Trudeau on this, or if it's something that happened just because of Trudeau. I think it's a blend of both. But that lack of not being proud of Canadian identity, we were told our flag represents genocide. We're told we don't have a core identity. And a lot of some of the references I was making about old school media in Canada, like Mr. Lawrence Martin, who has written several incredible books, or Peter C. Newman, who I thought was incredibly arrogant, but still had respect for his words. There's always one of the characters, and obviously these are nonfiction books, but what I would say is one of the characters in their book was always Canada herself in that very 80s, 90s Canadian way. You know, hockey was one thing, but what was Canada producing? We had Kandahar, we had the Blue Helmets. We we were seeing more and more young Canadians show up at Remembrance Day. The portrait of the Queen was still in government offices. Trudeau took all of those down when he showed up in 2015. We were told that we were inherently racist, misogynist knuckle draggers, and he specifically targeted Western Canadians on that. He has divided and conquered us, and if Canadians don't think they've been conquered, I'm here to tell you, you have been. You've been conquered, and your government I think has some very treasonous qualities to it. It has broken the backs of the middle class. It's broken the sectors that have put braces on my teeth and many other Canadians. People are burning out. They're committing suicide. The country is in a full malaise. And when I think of Canada, I don't see any joy. I just see a very sad, hurt country. We also have 1 million plus more new Canadians than we've ever had in a short period of time.
yeah.
That I don't believe they're connected. I believe that they have imported old fights from old worlds.
Oh,
And
yeah.
we see that at Toronto, in Toronto at Bathurst, the corner of Bathurst there. You know, I'm not saying all new Canadians have, but unfortunately, overwhelming majority seem to have been doing
But
that.
the problems are not Canadian problems. It's imported 100%. Yeah, I just feel like as long as we can educate and elevate, I think it takes longer, but I think that's how we're going to get there. I think that importing other people's problems isn't helpful when we have so many of our own to begin
That's a
with.
Canadian thing we do, though, Eva. When we've got all of these problems bubbling over and have for a decade, but we were so hyper focused on Trump. The first administration, the second administration, that's all anyone's focused on. And I'll tell you something. If Trump hadn't been around in that first administration, Trudeau would not have won that re-election. I don't think so. I think he was able to
Capitalize
I
on
think he was
that.
able to hide behind it too. He used it as a deflection. I'm not Trump. And everything he said was through that lens.
Yeah.
And Canadians were very happy to see that. And then Jan 6 rolled around, and that was another good reason for him to start campaigning.
Yeah.
He held a needless election. People forget that because they were in their own fifth ring of hell. There are so many Canadians that are bankrupt and broke and are broken from that period of time. And in fact, I think Justin Trudeau owes this country an apology. Um, with his father, I was raised at the knee to, really hate Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I don't really have any memory of those years, I'll be very honest with you, and I know you probably don't either. But what my father always said is he was never a stupid man.
Hmm.
Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a very smart man, and on the base level, you must respect a smart man. This that showed up is a joke.
Yeah.
And
No, I
yeah,
agree.
anyway.
Well, so this is where maybe I would like to end it is I think that I enjoy this kind of conversation. Like you have this knowledge that I don't have it all. And I think we have to start bridging those a little bit more. I think that's going to help because you mentioned it a few times, institutional knowledge that I think is being lost right now too. A lot of that. I also think that the leadership in this country really I'm calling for a whole new wave of new leaders that are educated, have some understanding in any area outside of just the political sphere. And I don't think it's bad that somebody like Pierre Poilievre has been in politics all his life. I don't think everybody in politics should be like that. I think there needs to be a diversity, but I also think there's benefits for somebody to really understand the ins and outs of the political sphere. And at this point, I'm pretty sure he does. But I really think education, having conversations like these, and calling for a new generation of leaders is what's going to get us out of the stagnation, at least at a minimum, those three things if we could start with. So I think we've gotten that out of this conversation, and I thank you so much for the knowledge and the insight into what was going on before. And it's really interesting to hear also too why you think it changed in that power dynamic. And good, we need that to see things like that. So I'm grateful, I'm thankful that these things are happening, but I think we have to capitalize on them a little bit.
I would say to you and to your listeners, and you're obviously a leader in that community that is looking for the very things that you've just outlined. And I'm rowing with you. I'm rowing hard with you on that. I would say don't let this opportunity that Trump has given us. I don't think it was obviously on purpose, but I do know a lot more Canadians are talking about things. But I would just say this: nothing is really made in Canada. Get off that whole made in Canada thing. And to all the advertisers like Crave, I saw an ad from them. It's 100% Canadian company. It's 92% American content. So, jog on, Crave. But I would say once you get over the whatever warm and fuzzy feelings you have for your country, because nothing has changed. I want everyone to hear this. The only thing that changed was Trump. And Trump has every right to put a 25% tariff. And I'm not saying I'm going to love it. In fact, I think it will affect my business dramatically. And I'm frightened and I'm worried, but it doesn't make me blind to the international law and what a sovereign country can and cannot do. And and I think that this reaction to it is made even worse because the Trump mania or whatever has happened to their brains, it has just exemplified it. But I want people to take away not the hat or the sloganisms. I want them to take away that the very thing that you are really fighting for is the uniqueness of Canada. And that is the one thing, the one tiny little piece that I'm holding on to of Canada, and I'm holding it really close to my heart. What makes us different shouldn't be used as weapons. We should be able to knit ourselves together. I hope this reminds Canadians that when you see someone like me talking on TV about boring internal trade and like the Canada Trade Act, which was put together in 2017 and nothing's happened since then, that they'll remember that this is a slow, conservative country, has very provincial ideas. It's a bit of a pearl clutcher of a country as well. It doesn't like it when things change. This is not the same world. You can't get away with being that Canada anymore. You can never, ever ghost your allies. You can never break contracts. You can never falsify narratives anymore. There is no excuse for the country to get off their arses and get back to work and start producing and celebrating entrepreneurs and research and development. You need a very entrepreneurial thinking type government to get that flowing. The provinces cannot do that by themselves, although Daniel Smith, I think, has done an exceptional job using that spirit to solve some healthcare crisis. Your, drug program has been fantastic. Rehabilitation program, it's something we should all look to. But forget about the sloganisms. Don't listen to the legacy media. They're using the so-called crisis in Canada for their own benefit. We need to remember what makes this place great. And when it is great, it is goddamn great. It is great. So, but I want to thank you for having me on your show. And I've really admired you for a long time. And as I said, we've crossed paths before, but you probably won't remember. And I just wish all the best for you. And I think you are, like I said, are a dynamo, and keep on talking, keep on having shows. And what I'd like to see is listeners or viewers of this podcast, how do you keep the conversation going? Because I feel I can barely get it up for Canada right now. I'm really angry with her. And how are we going to hold the people that really broke her accountable? How are we going to do that? Because there needs to be accountability. You can't just push this under the rug anymore.
Well, I am suing the government, so that gives me a little bit more excitement, because then that's how I'm going to hold it to account. But yeah, no, thank you so much. That was excellent. And we're just going to do a few more minutes for my paid Twitter subscribers as well. So we'll end here, and thank you. That was a lovely way to end it as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you. You take good care. We'll talk soon.